Imagine, if you will, the English countryside in mid-April 1981. It was a landscape that seemed to have finally shaken off the shackles of a long, grey winter. Across the United Kingdom, from the rolling hills of the Cotswolds to the rugged coastlines of the north, a golden mirage had taken hold. The sun was not merely shining, it was radiating a warmth that felt like a permanent promise. Temperatures had surged to a staggering 20 degrees Celsius, the mildest start to April in over 2 decades. In gardens across the nation, the daffodils were standing tall, their yellow trumpets heralds of a season that everyone believed was here to stay. Cherry blossoms draped the suburbs in delicate lace, and the fresh lime-green leaves of spring were unfurling with a confidence that felt unshakable. It was a week of short sleeves, the garden barbecues, and the triumphant clicking of lawn mowers. The psychological shift was total. British families, conditioned by years of unpredictable weather, finally felt safe enough to perform that annual ritual of domestic surrender, packing away the winter gear. Thousands of heavy wool coats, thick cable-knit jumpers and fur-lined boots were folded neatly into mothballed trunks and pushed into the dark corners of attics. The central heating was switched off, the coal bunkers were allowed to run low, and the snow shovels were tucked away in the very back of garden sheds, presumed useless for at least another 6 months. There was a collective sense of relief, a national sigh of contentment. Spring hadn't just arrived, it had conquered. Easter Monday, April 20th, passed under a canopy of blue sky and gentle breezes, reinforcing the illusion that the elements had finally called a truce. But as the sun set on that blissful Easter, the atmosphere was quietly preparing a betrayal of historic proportions. High above the Arctic Circle, a massive reservoir of frigid polar air had begun to leak southwards, like a predator stalking an unsuspecting prey. It was moving with a silent, terrifying velocity, pushed by a shift in the jet stream that nobody saw coming. As the warm, balmy air of mid-April was unceremoniously shoved aside, the wind turned northerly, carrying a bitter metallic edge that began to sear the new spring buds. The temperature didn't just drop, it collapsed. By the night of April 22nd, the transition was complete. The stage was set for a meteorological collision that would pit the fragile beauty of spring against the brutal, an unyielding force of an Arctic winter, a blizzard that didn't belong in the calendar of man, but in the chaos of nature. By the early hours of April 23rd, 1981, the British Isles were no longer witnessing a mere cold snap. They were facing an atmospheric execution. The polar guillotine had fallen. Across the Scottish Highlands at Dalwhinnie, the mercury plummeted to a bone-shattering -10 degrees Celsius, the coldest late April temperature recorded since the turn of the century in 1908. But the cold was only half of the story. A deep, low-pressure system, moisture-heavy and aggressive, was surging in from the Atlantic, and as it collided with the wall of Arctic air sitting over the UK, the result was a meteorological explosion. The rain didn't just turn to snow, it transformed into a relentless, blinding white curtain that refused to lift. This was not the light, powdery dusting of a romantic winter evening. This was wet snow, a heavy, crystalline sludge that carried the weight of lead. Across the Midlands, in cities like Birmingham, the temperature struggled to climb above 3 degrees for 3 consecutive days. For citizens who expected a seasonal average of 16 degrees, the shock was physical. You could see it in the breath of people standing in their own kitchens, staring out of windows with a mixture of awe and terror. The snow began to accumulate with a terrifying speed, burying the very daffodils that had been basking in 20-degree sunshine just 72 hours earlier. The contrast was haunting. Vibrant yellow petals, symbols of life and rebirth, now choked and bowed under a suffocating weight of white. The accumulation figures began to read like a dispatch from a Siberian winter. By the morning of the 25th, The parts of southern and western England were buried under 20 centimetres of level snow. But it was in Gloucestershire and the Peak District where the situation turned truly apocalyptic. In Gloucestershire, the landscape vanished under a staggering 66 centimetres, over 2 feet of solid, heavy snow. In the hills of Derbyshire and Staffordshire, the wind began to play a much more sinister role. Gale-force gusts, reaching 40 miles per hour, whipped the falling flakes into gargantuan drifts. These were not mere piles of snow, they were 20-foot walls of white, 6-metre-high barriers that rendered the geography of the country unrecognisable. Roads that had been clear and dry on Wednesday had, by Saturday morning, become invisible, swallowed by a frozen ocean that seemed to have no end. As the weekend of April 25th took hold, the infrastructure of Great Britain began to buckle under a weight it was never designed to carry in the spring. This wasn't just a travel delay, it was a total systemic failure. The M4 motorway, the vital artery connecting London to the west, was transformed into a surreal 60-mile car park. Drifts reaching 1.5 metres high effectively barricaded entire sections of the asphalt. Drivers, caught in shoes meant for April sunshine and light jackets designed for a spring breeze, found themselves trapped in a frozen metal purgatory. As the hours ticked by, fuel ran low and heaters flickered out. Many were forced to abandon their vehicles, trudging through knee-deep, as freezing slush toward distant village lights. A desperate pilgrimage through a landscape that felt more like the Alaskan tundra than southern England. But the true terror of the 1981 freeze lay in the silence. In an era long before the digital safety net of mobile phones and the internet, Britain relied on a fragile web of overhead copper wires. The nature of this April snow, heavy, wet, and incredibly adhesive, was a lethal enemy to telecommunications. As the slush clung to the lines, it froze into thick, icy cables that weighed hundreds of pounds. Across entire regions of Wales and the Midlands, the sound of snapping wood echoed through the night as telephone poles splintered like matchsticks. Thousands of homes were plunged into a terrifying isolation. If your line went dead, you were effectively vanished from the world. And there was no way to call for a doctor, no way to check on an elderly parent living 3 miles away, and no way to know if help was even on the way. The power grid followed suit. The weight of the ice brought down high-voltage cables, plunging whole towns into darkness. For the families huddled inside, the reality was grim. The central heating, so confidently switched off a week prior, was useless without electricity. Those lucky enough to have coal fires became the guardians of the neighbourhood's warmth, while others huddled under every blanket they owned, watching candles flicker in the gloom. Outside, the wind howled at 40 miles per hour, pushing the snow sideways in a relentless assault, piling it higher and higher against the front doors until the world outside the glass was nothing but a solid, unyielding wall of white. However, it was a moment of profound vulnerability, a reminder that for all its industrial might, the nation remained at the mercy of a sky that had forgotten it was spring. While the cities struggled with darkness and blocked roads, a far more visceral and silent tragedy was unfolding across the rural heartlands of Britain. April is a sacred month in the agricultural calendar. It is the season of lambing, a time of rebirth, and the promise of a new harvest. But in 1981, the fields of Dartmoor, the Welsh valleys, and the rolling hills of the north became a graveyard for the innocent. Thousands of newborn lambs, just hours or days old, who had been born into the deceptive balmy sunshine of the previous week, were suddenly ambushed by a blizzard that offered no mercy. These fragile creatures, their fleece still thin and inadequate against the biting Arctic gale, found themselves shivering in a world that had turned from green to a lethal, blinding white. The farmers, driven by a mixture of economic necessity and a profound generational duty to their livestock, worked around the clock in conditions that defied human endurance. Imagine a shepherd on the slopes of the Pennines, struggling through waist-deep drifts in the dead of night, his flashlight beam barely penetrating the swirling wall of snow. He is searching for sheep that have huddled instinctively against stone walls, only to be buried alive as the wind piles the snow over them like a shifting tomb. Some farmers spent 48 hours without sleep, carrying freezing lambs into their own kitchens, placing them near the embers of coal fires or wrapping them in blankets in a desperate bid to kickstart their tiny hearts. But for many, the effort was in vain. By morning, the grisly reality would be revealed. Mothers standing guard over stiff, frozen forms that would never stand a chance. The devastation extended to the cattle as well. Spring calves, born during the mild Easter Monday, were now facing temperatures that dropped to -10 degrees. The cost was not just emotional, it was a financial catastrophe for families living on the razor-thin margins of the 1980s. The loss of livestock meant the loss of a year's income, a crushing blow to communities that were already feeling the pinch of a changing economy. As the farmers looked out over their white-shrouded fields, the silence was broken only by the mournful bleating of ewes and the roar of the northerly wind. It was a stark, brutal reminder that in the battle between man and the elements, nature never plays fair, especially when it chooses to strike during the most vulnerable window of the year. As the storm reached its final terrifying crescendo between April 26th and 27th, 1981, nature decided to unveil its most surreal phenomenon. Across the Pennines, the Cotswolds, and down into the Salisbury Plain, the sky didn't just howl, it crackled with electricity. This was thunder snow, a rare, eerie spectacle where lightning flashes in brilliant strobe-like bursts through a curtain of falling white. The sky lit up in ghostly violet and stark white against the blinding snow, followed by the muffled, heavy boom of thunder that seemed to vibrate through the very ground. For many huddled in their darkened, freezing homes, it felt like the world was ending. A celestial battle between the seasons that defied every law of the calendar. Winds gusting at 50 miles per hour pushed the visibility to zero, to creating a frozen white wall that felt impenetrable. Then, as abruptly as it had arrived, the Arctic trap snapped open. On the morning of April 28th, the wind shifted once more, drawing in mild, humid air from the Atlantic. The temperature didn't just rise, it surged. But this was not the gentle thaw the nation had prayed for. It was the beginning of a second disaster. The vast volumes of snow, 60 centimetres deep in Gloucestershire and even deeper in the drifts, began to melt at an impossible rate. Because the ground beneath had been frozen solid for days, it acted like concrete, unable to absorb a single drop of the sudden runoff. Millions of tons of meltwater cascaded down the hillsides, funneling into the river valleys of the East Midlands and the South. But what followed was the worst flooding the region had witnessed since the historic catastrophe of 1947. Streets that had been blocked by white walls just 48 hours earlier were now transformed into raging brown rivers. Homes that had barely survived the weight of the snow were now inundated with freezing, muddy water. Families who had spent days shivering in the dark now found themselves wading through their living rooms, watching their carpets, furniture, and family heirlooms be ruined by a deluge they never saw coming. The cleanup would take months, and the economic cost was staggering. The April snow of 1981 remains etched in the British collective memory as the ultimate lesson in humility. It was the blizzard that nobody predicted, the winter that refused to stay in its grave. For those who were there, and the memories are a strange tapestry of hardship and community, the surreal sight of tulips poking through 2 feet of snow, the roar of thunder during a blizzard, and the neighbours who shared their last bag of coal. It remains a stark reminder that even when the daffodils are in bloom and the sun feels warm on your back, nature always keeps its most unpredictable cards hidden until the very last moment. We adapt, we shovel, and we remember. Because in Britain, you never truly know when the sky might turn white one last time.